April 20th, 1945. Just weeks before the end of the Second World War, the rolling hills of Bavaria lay battered. The last vestiges of Nazi resistance clung to shattered towns where frightened civilians hid among the ruins of a collapsing Reich. Smoke drifted from a crumbling farmhouse near the small village of Miesbach, signaling distress to anyone roaming the countryside. American forces were advancing after crossing the Danube, pushing deeper into southern Germany toward Munich and the imminent German surrender. Sergeant James Harper from the 3rd Infantry Division led a reconnaissance squad tasked with clearing farm settlements of potential enemy snipers. The farmstead appeared abandoned, the fields silent except for distant artillery and crows circling above the smoking barn roof. As Harper's squad approached, their rifles raised for danger, they sensed something unnatural in the air. The barn door was slightly ajar, hanging crookedly, its hinges burned black, but inside, no livestock sounds echoed back. Instead, faint whimpering and shallow breathing reached their ears like a chorus of fear trapped within wooden walls. Harper signaled silent advance and pushed the barn doors open, revealing a sight that froze every soldier in place. 200 children lay scattered across straw and broken crates, barely alive, wearing tattered clothes stained by tears and soot. Some clutched each other for warmth. Others stared blindly at the intruders, too weak to react or cry. The odor of starvation, sickness, and despair permeated the structure as dust and smoke hung like funeral veils above them. These were not enemy combatants nor civilian guards, but orphaned German children abandoned in war's final merciless descent into chaos. Harper's unit expected traps or ambush, not the hollow faces of starving innocents, barely clinging to any breath left. Their orders were clear. Enemy territory meant no engagement unless fired upon, but nothing prepared them for this moral battlefield. The rules of war dictated neutrality toward enemy civilians, especially children without identity or protective authority under official custody. Yet the sight compelled something deeper than protocol, a call older than nations and stronger than wartime hatred. Harper's men lowered their weapons, their hearts turning from soldiers to human beings, confronting war's most unforgivable casualty, childhood stolen. No shots were fired, but a different battle began here between duty and conscience, between regulations and the soul. That moment in the smoking Bavarian barn was not marked in military reports, but it forever altered generations through mercy. The moment the soldiers crossed the threshold of the barn, time seemed to slow under the weight of shock. They had seen destruction before. They had marched through towns reduced to ash, but nothing prepared them for this sight. 200 children, no older than 15, lay scattered like fallen leaves across the blood-stained straw floor. Some were motionless, others stirred weakly, their limbs reduced to skeletal outlines beneath filthy, threadbare clothing. A few pairs of hollow eyes blinked in the darkness, unsure if the approaching soldiers were salvation or death. The stifling air was thick with the odors of sickness, fear, and rotting grain from broken wooden crates. The soldiers removed their helmets, as if entering a sacred space, their weapons suddenly feeling useless in their hands. No enemy forces were present, no German officers, only these forgotten children who had fled a burning orphanage. Harper's heart clenched as one young boy tried to stand, then collapsed into a painful shiver on the straw. Here lay the true cost of war, a battlefield without bullets, a massacre without gunfire or shelling. The children had marched over 40 miles from Munich after their caretakers fled during an Allied bombing. Weeks without food had turned their march into a death sentence, each mile claiming smaller, weaker lives. 3 lifeless bodies lay in the corner, wrapped hurriedly in torn sheets by the older children. One of the girls, who retained strength beyond her years, explained in broken whispers what had happened. She spoke of the fire, the panic, the endless walking, and the promise they would find help here. Harper's men had been trained to clear buildings, not cradle dying children with trembling hands and broken spirits. Their rules of engagement said nothing about delivering aid, nothing about crossing lines drawn by politics or war. As the wind rustled through cracked boards above them, Harper knew decisions made here would alter far more than orders. His gaze fell upon a baby girl, barely breathing, wrapped in a dirty coat that was not her own. Suddenly, the battle was no longer against the enemy, but against time, hunger, and indifference. Somewhere outside, the distant rumble of artillery resumed, as though war itself demanded an answer from these intruders. But inside the barn, another kind of struggle had already begun, one that would shape every life that entered. The men were no longer just soldiers surrounded by ash, but witnesses to the truth war could never justify. Sergeant James Harper stood in the center of the barn, surrounded by children whose faces had erased every illusion of victory. Each hollow stare stripped away the thin armor of his uniform, leaving him as human as the child clutching his boot. War regulations dictated no involvement with enemy civilians, especially in conditions where supplies and responsibility were undefined. But the regulations had not witnessed the small hand that tugged at Harper's sleeve, or the silent plea in a child's eyes. In that moment, he understood that this decision would define his legacy more than any battlefield triumph ever could. The internal struggle of a soldier's conscience is seldom captured in history books, but it echoed powerfully here. Choices in war are often black and white, yet this barn existed in a realm untouched by command or policy. To walk away meant obeying orders, yet abandoning their humanity in the process, a cost far greater than military punishment. Harper knew that starvation was the immediate enemy, and these children had no strength left to wait for procedure. A war might end on paper, but here it still raged, silent in bodies that had forgotten laughter. He gathered his men and spoke quietly, his voice carrying more weight than any battlefield command he ever issued. "We help them," he said, his tone final, unflinching, cementing a decision that would shift the fate of 200 souls. The soldiers hesitated, knowing the risks of defying policy, of being court-martialed for unauthorized humanitarian action. But none of them turned away, their shared humanity overpowering whatever fear lingered in the shadow of potential punishment. These were not soldiers now, nor strangers, but men choosing to deliver mercy where orders had delivered silence. Outside the barn, the world still burned, armies still advanced, generals still debated strategies for territory and surrender. Inside, a different war was being fought, not for conquest, but for dignity, for the fragile spark of life in brittle bones. Harper's resolve transformed the barn into a battlefield for compassion, one where their weapons were blankets, bread, and courage. There was no medal for what they chose to do, no victory parade for saving children instead of killing foes. Yet somewhere deep inside every man present, a quiet revolution was taking hold, one that no uniform could suppress. Harper knew the consequences awaited him, but for now, that barn was sacred ground, and his duty had changed forever. The decision was made with no more than 4 words. "We help them," spoken softly, yet they roared through the silence. It was not a command in the traditional military sense, but a vow of human dignity transcending any battlefield directive. The soldiers looked at one another, their expressions revealing a shift from rigid obedience to living embodiments of compassion. Weapons were set aside, helmets removed, and field rations unpacked in a flurry of urgency and emotional purpose. In that moment, the barn in Bavaria became a sanctuary, not of war, but of bruised innocence and desperate hope. Harper and his men worked tirelessly, transforming their limited supplies into life-saving offerings for the starving children. Canteens filled with precious water were placed into quivering hands, while torn uniforms were stripped to create makeshift blankets. Their packs held no medicines, no medical expertise, only soldiers' instincts and hearts refusing to surrender to indifference. One child, barely more than a skeleton, wept when a soldier lifted him, too weak to understand rescue but needing touch. Another girl, no older than 6, clung to a ration bar as if it were a miracle in her palm. Outside, the war continued, but inside, war rules were being rewritten in the rawest form imaginable. The soldiers took turns boiling water, sharing their last reserves of chocolate, and crushing tablets into improvised medicine. Their uniforms remained the same, but their purpose had transformed completely, no longer agents of destruction, but life preservers. Every act, every gesture defied the military handbook, but honored a deeper, universal code buried beneath war's brutality. A code that said a child, any child, regardless of origin or flag, deserved to live in peace. As day turned to dusk, Harper knew what he had done would reach commanders, tribunals, perhaps the headlines back home. Still, he stood resolute, watching his men tending to the children as though caring for their own family. He felt no fear now, only a calm understanding that right often walks alone before justice finally catches up. The children, once silent shadows in the straw, began to stir and speak, life slowly returning where death had waited. Harper settled into the straw, a child resting against his shoulder, and for the first time in years, he wept. In less than 24 hours, the once abandoned Bavarian barn transformed into a lifeline, fueled by nothing more than desperation and resolve. What began as a mission to secure German territory now became a race against time, fought with blankets and bread instead of bullets. Harper's men scouted the nearby farms, bartering cigarettes and canned meat for tools, bandages, and livestock feed turned into nourishment. They commandeered wooden planks to reinforce walls, dug fire pits to heat water, and repurposed old wagon tarps into shelter. In every corner, survival became a makeshift science, and the barn, once a tomb of hopelessness, breathed again. The soldiers labored without glory, fashioning beds from straw, creating stoves from salvaged metal, and burning furniture for warmth. They divided the children by age and condition, building a triage system from nothing but urgency and soldier's instinct. A medic from another unit secretly joined them, risking his own court-martial to administer sulfa drugs and teach rudimentary care. The older children, previously leaders among the starving, now became assistants, boiling water, washing cloths, holding trembling hands. The barn echoed, not with cries of death, but with the unfamiliar sound of whispered prayers and quiet determination. Despite exhaustion, the men found reserves of strength they never knew existed, spurred by the sight of children reviving. Tiny fingers wrapped around rough camouflage sleeves, timid voices whispered, "Danke," and for a moment, divisions of war dissolved entirely. Even the hardest veterans, who had seen comrades fall and cruelty prevail, felt their hearts fracture at the smallest smiles. This barn, a site of suffering, became the truest battlefield of the war, where compassion fought despair one breath at a time. The Grim Reaper, frequently victorious, found himself challenged by men who had forgotten they were still at war. But the price of defiance loomed, as whispers traveled through military channels about unauthorized aid, dwindling supplies, and broken protocol. Harper's report, delayed and cautiously worded, still revealed the truth. 200 enemy orphans were being fed by American troops. The barn, now pulsing with fragile life, remained both miracle and violation, an unapproved sanctuary defying the machinery of war. Outside the farmhouse, the sky filled with distant gunfire, but inside, hope grew stronger than the hunger that once ruled. For a fleeting moment in 1945, soldiers laid down the laws of war and upheld the laws of humanity, saving a future generation. News of Harper's actions did not remain buried in the barn's straw floors. It climbed the chain of command swiftly. Whispers turned into formal reports, and soon headquarters demanded an explanation for the unauthorized care of enemy civilians. Harper's message, sent days late and written with measured restraint, could not conceal the truth of his defiance. Photographs attached told a story no sanitized briefing could ignore: American soldiers nursing German children back to health. To command, the issue was not the miracle, but the mutiny, a breach of wartime regulation and military protocol. Harper was summoned under accusations of aiding the enemy, misuse of rations, and dereliction of wartime duty. His men were interrogated separately, questioned about orders, about supplies diverted, about loyalty to the chain of command. In the cold language of war, compassion could be labeled treason, and mercy could be called collaboration. Military lawyers prepared charges while commanders debated whether discipline or silence would best preserve their public image. What Harper saw as a moral victory now threatened to erase his career, perhaps even land him behind bars. Back at the barn, the children knew nothing of military courts, only the kindness of the men who stayed. They clung to blankets and laughter, while outside the world weighed their savior's fate like stones on a scale. Harper returned briefly, his face drawn, but his eyes determined, unwilling to regret a single decision made in that place. His men gathered around, loyal not to paperwork or policy, but to the purpose that had united them in those dark hours. Together, they stood between law and life, defying a system that demanded soldiers win wars but forget their souls. Newspapers caught wind of the story, some calling Harper a hero, others branding him a disgrace to uniformed service. Supporters praised the act as proof that even among destruction, humanity could still take root and blossom. Critics warned that aiding German children while American families mourned dead soldiers was unforgivable and unpatriotic. The controversy spread far beyond Bavaria, pulling in voices from Congress, clergy, and mothers of fallen troops alike. War, it seemed, was not only fought on battlefields, but in the hearts and headlines of an uncertain nation. Now, facing tribunal, Harper prepared his defense, knowing that history's verdict might be kinder than the one awaiting him. But he had already made peace with the truth, that obeying orders without conscience is not victory, but surrender of the soul. The firestorm reached its peak when a wealthy American widow named Eleanor Patterson offered to sponsor all 200 children. She pledged transport, housing, education, and permanent care in the United States on her family's sprawling New York estate. What began as a field decision in a Bavarian barn now crossed the Atlantic, stirring both admiration and fury at home. Military officials reluctantly approved the relocation, weary of public outcry and wary that punishing compassion might cause further scandal. Soon, ships carrying the orphans left war-torn Europe, turning the tides from shattered past to uncertain new beginning. But their arrival in New York Harbor was far from a scene of universal welcome and warm applause. Protesters lined the docks, waving signs condemning the idea of giving haven to enemy children, while Americans still suffered. Veteran unions demanded priority for American orphans, farmers criticized aid to foreigners, and grieving parents called the act betrayal. The word enemy was repeated like a curse, branding children responsible for horrors they never asked to be part of. Police held the crowds back, but the message was clear: mercy was controversial, and the battle for acceptance had only begun. At Patterson Estate, the atmosphere shifted from riots to refuge, as the children stepped onto sprawling green lawns never seen before. They fumbled with English, feared the sudden abundance of food, and recoiled from the unfamiliar calm of uninterrupted sleep. Doctors examined them, teachers introduced reading and arithmetic, and counselors helped them face memories darker than their years deserved. Some neighbors extended cautious support, others watched with suspicion, unable to forget the uniforms their sons died fighting overseas. For the orphans, every day was a mixture of healing and reminder, of warmth and invisible wounds left by headlines and stares. Patterson herself welcomed the children like an army of her own, not of conquest, but courageous survival. She wrote letters to senators, composed articles defending their worth, and opened her estate to journalists and skeptics alike. One reporter wrote that the children raised flags at dawn, but did not yet understand which nation now claimed them. In time, their German lullabies faded, replaced by English rhymes. Their rigid posture softened into the restless pace of youth. Here, in the heart of a country their parents once called enemy, they would learn to live again, one uncertain day at a time. Though the war had ended on paper, its scars now crossed oceans, etched in tiny hands clutching both hope and history. The transformation began slowly, as the children learned to trust a world that no longer chased them with fire and hunger. They arrived speaking almost no English, clutching their pasts in silent fists, still haunted by bombs, betrayal, and endless walking. Teachers at the estate worked patiently, using pictures, gestures, and kind smiles to bridge the distance between languages and scars. Meals that once caused panic now brought laughter, though some children still hid food under pillows out of old reflexes. Each night, soft beds replaced cold straw, yet dreams often returned them to burning barns and the smell of smoke. Communities surrounding the Patterson estate watched cautiously, unsure whether these war children would ever fit into American life. Some families brought cookies and books, believing compassion was stronger than any lingering wartime bitterness or suspicion. Others crossed streets when the orphans walked by, their gaze still stained with grief from sons lost in distant battles. The children absorbed all of it, learning to smile at acceptance and grow silent in the presence of fear. Slowly, their identity evolved from enemy orphans into cherished members of a community still deciding how to heal. One young girl named Greta became the first to break through, charming local shopkeepers with her determined English lessons. Her courage inspired others, who began running in fields, practicing schoolyard games, and asking questions about everything they saw. Boys who once dug graves for their friends now learned woodworking from a local carpenter who treated them like apprentices. Harper visited when he could, watching with quiet pride as the children he once saved blossomed into something unrecognizable. His men, scattered across post-war assignments, exchanged letters describing how that barn had forever rewritten their purpose as soldiers and men. By the third year, the estate had become a model for orphan rehabilitation, studied by social workers and praised in newspapers. Many of the children began excelling in school, their grades challenging stereotypes once written in ink and prejudice. They learned history, languages, and jazz, planting German words beside American dreams in their growing minds. Patterson hosted annual reunions, celebrating birthdays, graduations, and each new milestone reached by her expanding family of survivors. In this place, once filled with uncertainty, the children found not only shelter, but also identity, hope, and belonging beyond borders. Here, beneath the wide American sky, they no longer carried the label of enemy, but the promise of a shared future together. Half a century after the brutal air raid that claimed approximately 3,000 German civilians in Dresden, the world was left grappling with the unhealed scars of a war that reshaped every continent and altered human destiny forever. Each generation since then has wrestled with the same moral question, asking whether any strategic gain could justify such overwhelming loss, as survivors passed on stories marked by smoke-filled skies, collapsed cathedrals, and vanished families left without a trace. Their collective grief became a permanent thread within Europe's post-war conscience, silently shaping treaties, alliances, and the unspoken vow that such destruction should never again be tolerated. Urban planners walked through reconstructed Dresden streets, tracing the once fire-blackened stones now polished by decades of peace, understanding that every rebuilt archway and restored bridge symbolized both survival and sorrow, an architectural reminder that stories of loss could not be erased by cement or stone. Historical societies fought to preserve the remaining ruins, insisting that these fragments of past devastation must remain as stark monuments against forgetfulness, so future generations would never mistake the quiet for absence of pain. Artists carved through marble and memory alike, while poets filled pages with elegies that tried and failed to soften the brutal arithmetic of war's cold calculus. In military academies from West Point to Sandhurst, instructors lectured on Dresden not as a victory or defeat, but as a lesson in ethics, technology, and the troubling evolution of total war, noting how the line between battlefield and city blurred forevermore under fleets of bombers. Diplomatic circles used its memory to strengthen conventions against civilian targeting, drafting agreements raised upon foundations built by tears and ash. German and American veterans occasionally met in public forums, sharing testimonies that cracked through decades of silence, revealing a universal longing for peace that transcended flags and national memory. Parents told children that the city once burned so hot the rivers boiled, not to cloud their dreams with fear, but to anchor their hope in reality, reminding them that the cost of hatred is always human, measured in names never spoken again. Museums archived letters, diaries, and charred photographs, each relic whispering answers to questions students did not always dare to ask. 50 years later, the legacy of those 3,000 lives endured not only in stone and policy, but in the fragile courage of remembrance, where humanity's path forward was lit by embers of its darkest night. In the closing months of the Second World War, Allied commanders began realizing that traditional victory metrics no longer fully applied, as the sheer devastation of Europe posed questions that artillery could not answer. Cities lay in ruins, civilians scattered in trauma-stricken clusters, and armies, victorious or defeated, struggled to comprehend the human toll beneath the smoke. Amid destruction, a new understanding emerged, one that suggested victory was not merely about seizing ground or shattering divisions, but rather about restoring humanity where brutality had reigned for too long. Compassion showed itself in small but transformative acts, from medical units treating enemy wounded to field kitchens feeding civilians regardless of flag or language, moments that signaled a deeper shift in how war itself was understood. Strategists and statesmen began to see humanitarian choices as crucial tools for ensuring peace, knowing punitive cycles only bred future enemies. Economists recommended rebuilding rather than punishing shattered societies, recognizing that prosperity dampened ideological extremism faster than repression ever could. Propaganda ministries stopped demonizing entire populations and started preaching reconciliation, framing former enemies as future partners in rebuilding a shared and stable continent. Formerly rigid officers found value in moral negotiations, learning that ending bloodshed did not demand humiliation, but sometimes a generous hand extended toward a broken adversary. This philosophical shift affected policy at every level, shaping tribunals at Nuremberg where justice rejected slaughter and chose legal accountability, a milestone that preserved truth without deepening barbarity. Relief agencies distributed bread before pamphlets, proving that democracy required dignity as its foundation, not just ballots or new constitutions. Veterans remembered freezes in ruined towns where they decided to share rations rather than fire rifles, and such moments became stories not of weakness, but of a turning point in history's calculation of strength. These experiences reshaped military doctrines, embedding ethics as part of training, a counterweight to firepower that sought to keep future wars from dissolving into total moral collapse. The Marshall Plan embodied this mercy on a planetary scale, sending dollars instead of bombs, showing the world what victory could look like when framed through generosity rather than domination. Decades later, the peaceful evolution of Europe stood not only as a result of overwhelming force, but as proof that compassion multiplies stability where cruelty only divides. When historians measured the true cost of the war, they recognized that the greatest triumph was not simply ending conflict, but rebuilding hope. In the mathematics of mercy, it was compassion, multiplied, not withheld, that secured the brighter future generations now inherited.